Warlick. Good morning, everyone. My name is David Warlick, and I have been invited to be one of the keynote speakers at this conference. Of course, you're all sitting in a variety of places, in your homes, in your offices, in your living rooms, out on the beach. I don't know where, and it doesn't really matter. I'm sitting here in my office, looking out on a sort of a cloudy day, but at least it's not getting up to 102 degrees here. In fact, I think it's not going to get above 85 degrees here in Raleigh, which we're very, very happy about. What I'd like to do today is very different from anything that I've done before, and basically I'm just going to go back to my Southern heritage and just tell you some stories. And this is one big story in a sense, and it's going to come in 10 parts, and these are just instances from my experience as an educator, and these are experiences that have sort of been focal points for me professionally and philosophically in terms of discovering the potentials of technology in education. Of course, I was using technology in education when I first started teaching, and this was before the desktop computer. This was before the personal computer. In fact, I looked it up a while back. When I became a history teacher, calculators still cost $200. And what's really funny is that they were advertised. I found an advertisement where it says, "This is the gift for a lifetime." And this is part of the theme of what I'm going to start off talking about today, and part of the theme that has colored a lot of my philosophy in education and the driving points of education today. Some of you are familiar with, some of you may even subscribe to a magazine called Wired. I became infatuated with the magazine when it was first published in 1993. I don't have the first or the second editions, which I understand go for a large amount of money on eBay, but I did start subscribing at the third edition, and I believe I have them all since then. But just recently, Wired published its first edition on an iPad version, and I believe that it's free, even for those who aren't subscribing. So if you download the iPad player for Wired, then that's one of the issues that you can download for free. And what's fascinating, and I'm going to go on to my next slide because this is part one, Tripping the Light Fantastic. What's really fun about looking at old Wired magazines, and I'm gonna drag over a photo of the initial issue, and it should show up on your screens in just a few minutes. But what's fascinating about going through old Wired magazines is looking at the advertisements and looking at what was being sold at that time and how it was being sold. And I've got another picture. This is a picture that I took out of that initial issue. And what you're looking at, or what you're going to be seeing in the next few seconds, is a GPS device that was sold by Sony. Now, the device cost about $1,200, and it connected to 4 satellites. This is all explained in the advertisement. And it admits that if you're lost, it might not get you found, but you're always going to know where you are, at least in relation to the equator and the prime meridian. and this thing was being sold for $1,200 at that time. This is 1993. Now, I've taken GPSs for granted for a number of years now, and it was only a couple of weeks ago that I downloaded a Garmin app for my iPhone that behaves, it operates exactly like the Garmin GPS that I carry around with me when I'm traveling, and it costs 99 cents. Now, back in 1993, when I was looking at this advertisement, and I was amazed at the potentials, at the possibilities of global positioning systems. This seemed fantastic. It was fantastic, and that's why you look at Wired magazines and similar magazines and many technology blogs. We look at them so we can see the fantastic. Yet, it was only a few years before this was something that we took for granted. And I think one of the most interesting things about being an educator today, and one of the things that we have to realize as educators, as a society that is defining education in this day and time, is that we're preparing our children for the fantastic. We are preparing them for the fantastic, for a time when what we now believe to be fantastic, unimaginable, just way out there is the world, the experience, the learning that they're going to be taking for granted in their future. So, one of the driving questions I think that we have to be asking as educators is what do children need to be learning? How do they need to be learning it in order to be ready for the fantastic? For me, I'm going to go on to the next slide. This is part 2, first contact. For me, it all began with technology back in 1981 or 82. I'm not absolutely sure which, but it was when I saw my first desktop computer. Now, I was familiar with computers. My dad was fascinated by computers when I was coming up, and he used to take me to his workplace where he would show me these big room-sized computers that could, at amazing speeds, within about 5 minutes, sort Hollerith, the stamp cards, the punch cards. It could arrange those in alphabetical order in about 5 minutes. I mean, he was just blown away by this sort of thing. So I had some familiarity with what computers were, but I had no idea what a personal computer would be. I've been seeing these Radio Shack computers in the magazines, in their catalogs, but I had no idea, what would you do with a personal computer? So I happened to be taking a class at the time, a recertification class in prescriptive reading and writing. And the professor's name was Dr. Thunderberg. And this was at Wingate College down outside of Monroe, North Carolina, where I was living at the time. And for one of the class sessions, he took us to his learning lab. He had established a learning lab there in Monroe where parents would bring their children in, and he would do all sorts of diagnostics as to why they weren't making the grades that the parents thought that they should be making, and prescribe different programs for them. And so he took us on a tour of his lab, and the first thing that I saw when we walked in was a Radio Shack Model 1 computer. In fact, I think I've got a picture of one of those for those youngsters out there that are totally unfamiliar with this. You should see appearing on your screen to the right a Radio Shack Model 1 computer. Now, my interest was piqued. Here's this computer. I'm going to see this computer. How's he using this as an educator? How's he using this for diagnostic prescriptive reading and writing? So he takes us on the tour. He takes us around to the different rooms, and he shows the different programs, and not computer programs, but the different instruments that he has. And then we come back to the main room where I'd seen the computer, and he dismisses us. And I raised my hand, Dr. Thunderberg, tell us about that computer. How are you using that computer? And he looked back and he said, I am so glad that you asked me about that. I'd completely forgotten. So he took us back to this Radio Shack Model 1 computer, and he sat me down at it. Now, again, I had no idea what you're going to do with this. I had no idea what I was going to see on that screen. I mean, I figured you'd just see, lights start flashing on the screen, in binary code or something like that. And he reached over underneath the keyboard. He flipped the switch. It came on. And up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, it said, ready. And I fell out of my seat. This was a machine that was talking to me. It's a machine that was telling me it was ready. Now, I got back up on my seat. He reached over my shoulder. He typed in a bunch of stuff. He typed in C-load math probe, something to that effect. C-load load off of cassette, because they didn't have discs back then. Certainly didn't have hard disks on personal computers. And you can see the cassette drive over there. So he had a program on a cassette that he was loading. It took about 3.5 minutes for the program to load into the computer. But when it finished, it put a list of options on the screen, and at the top it said, press the letter of the math problem you want to run. Now, not only was this computer communicating with me, but it was actually telling me how to operate it. It was telling me to press the letter that represents the side of the type of problem that I want. And he pointed out, this is called a menu. This is a list of options of things that you could do. So I scanned down, and I pressed D for long division. I wanted to try a long division problem, see what happened. So I put a long division problem up on the screen for me, and I worked through it. I typed in the numbers, and it put the numbers up on the screen in the correct place. Finally got to the correct answer. and the screen went blank. And for about 90 seconds or so, pixel by pixel, it made a picture of a smiling face, indicating that I'd gotten the correct answer. So, you know, I'm blown away, and this is absolutely amazing. And I started another long division problem, and this time I answered it incorrectly, and the screen went blank. And for about 90 seconds, pixel by pixel, it made a picture of a frowning face, and this was even more exciting than the smiling face. And you know, I was totally blown away. I'd never seen anything like this before. I had not imagined anything like this before. And what I realized on that day, and I couldn't have told you this at the time. I taught history, and I couldn't have told you this at the time, but I taught history from the perspective of technology. You know, that we invented the bow and arrow, and it affected culture in these ways. We invented agriculture, and it affected culture in these ways. And I saw this as one of those technologies that is going to have a profound effect on our culture, because what I was looking at was a machine that you operate by communicating with the machine. You operate the machine by communicating with the machine through a language. And I would suggest that part of being a connected educator today is being able to connect to the machine, being able to operate that machine by communicating with the machine. Now, I came back to school and I was all excited, and I talked to the principal about it, and he got kind of excited. And the next year, during the summer, somebody at the central office, I don't know who, but somebody at the central office had written a grant to get some computers into our schools, and it was in particular 2 middle schools within the district. And the middle school I was working in got one of those sets of computers. Now these were Radio Shack. Let me drag another picture in. These were Radio Shack Model 3 computers. Now these computers had 2 floppy disk drives, 16 kilobytes of memory. These things were hot. And you know, my school got 11 of them. And since none of the other teachers in my school had any interest in them at all, I got all 11 of those computers into my classroom. In 1982, I had an 11-unit computer lab in my classroom. The only problem was that there was no software. You know, the grant did not include software, because back then we believed that you know, just the green glow off of those cathode ray tubes washing over our children's faces would make them smarter. And we didn't know about software yet. That wasn't part of the computer literacy courses at the time. So I set about teaching myself how to program, which was an enormous learning experience for me, and for lots of reasons, not the least of which, I finally had a reason for all of that algebra that I'd taken when I was in high school and college. And what was most powerful, and I probably couldn't have described this at the time, but what was so powerful about it was that I was learning math by doing the math. And I wasn't just learning math and working problems, but I was using math to work numbers, you know, to make the computer work the numbers that made the computer behave the way that I needed it to. And it seems now like an enormously powerful way to learn mathematics is learning it by actually using it to work the numbers. Anyway, I started writing some software, writing some educational games for my students. And one of the first games that I wrote was a game called Stock Baron. Now this was it was a stock market simulation that the students could run. They could run it for a 6-month period. They would go up to the computer, they would start the program, they'd load and run the program. And it would start off with an online, not online, but a digital newsletter called the Wall Street Review. And this would feature 3 stories that I had written. I'd coded all this stuff in, so there were 3 contrived stories that I had put into the program. And each of those stories was designed to have either a positive or a negative effect on one of the 10 companies that the stock barons, the players, had an option to buy stock in. And they started out with $100,000 make-believe dollars. So they would read the first issue of Wall Street Review, decide which companies, from the stories that they got, decide which companies they should invest in, where they should buy stock in, which companies they shouldn't or sell stock in, and then they go to the next month and they see how much money they made or how much money they lost, and they get another issue of Wall Street Review. So they enjoyed it. It had, you know, it was about inference. It was about logic. It was about social studies. It was about mathematics. And it also became about something else. When after about a week and a half, a group of boys who called themselves the stock barons, they all had first period study hall. So they would you know, leave study hall first period, and they would all come into my classroom and they'd play stock baron. And after about a week and a half, these kids started making millions and millions and millions of dollars in 1 6-week period. And I couldn't figure out how, because I would get on it after school and I would play it, and the most I could make was about $500,000. You know, and I knew the codes. I wrote the program. I should be getting a perfect score. But these kids are making millions and millions of dollars. So I asked them, you know, how are you doing this? How are you making all this money? And they said, oh, Mr. Warlick, it's just shrewd business finance knowledge. We know how to do this. You don't. And this went on for about 2 weeks or so, until finally one of the boys waited until after school. Waited till the halls were clear, came into my classroom and said, Mr. Warlick, I need to explain to you how we're doing this. He said, we found a bug in your program. I taught him what a bug was. And he said, we found a bug in your program. He said, we learned that under these conditions, you can sell more stock than you own. So I took one of the computers home with me that night, and I worked on the code. I worked on the programming of it a bit. And I brought the computer back in, and before the kids came in, I loaded the program on all the other computers. And so first period, stock barons come marching in. And one particular boy, Pearson Duval, now, he was the king of the stock barons. And Pearson Duval comes strutting into the classroom. And he goes to his favorite computer, and he sits down, and he starts playing the game. And I'm watching Pearson Duval. I'm lecturing history stuff, and I'm watching Pearson Duval out of the corner of my eye, because I don't like Pearson Duval. And I'm watching him out of the corner of my eye. And that constant look of cockiness on his face, very slowly but certainly, turns into concern. And then it turns into downright worry. And he finally, my computer just went blank. That is not good.
We still see you, we can still hear you, and we're still seeing the slides.
Sorry. All right, just a moment. Okay, how's that?
Still good on our end.
Am I back? Okay, thank you. And I apologize. We had the same problem last time we did an interview, and I should have gone in and double-checked it. But I'll just keep moving the mouse around, and maybe that'll keep it from happening. And I kind of forget where I was. Oh, Pearson Duval, he's working on this program, and he's getting downright worried. And Pearson Duval, he finally, hesitantly raises his hand and says, Mr. Warlick, what does embezzlement mean? And why did I just get fined $2 million? And I will never forget the look on Pearson Duval's face when I got him. You know, I got him. I had tracked him. I had recoded this program in order to teach him something. And I will never forget that for that reason, but for another reason. And the other reason is that I realized on that day that the power of this machine was not so much that it's a machine that you operate by communicating with it. The real power of it is that this is a machine through which we can communicate with each other in powerful new ways by constructing, using it like Legos, using it to construct learning experiences for our students. I mean, it was the first analogy that came to mind as I started teaching myself to program, is that this is like playing with Legos, except you have a limitless number of parts and a limitless number of ways that you can put these commands together, that you can put these concepts together to make these experiences. And I would suggest that the connected educator needs to be someone who can connect with the machine, but also needs to be someone who can connect with learners through the machine. So it's not just about connecting with the machine and operating the machine, but it's about using this machine to construct experiences through which we can connect to learners in very powerful experiential ways. Part 3 of this story, constructing an experience. And I feel like I've gotten a little bit ahead here, but not so much. number of years later, I had moved from that middle school. I'd moved up to a school district in the northern part of North Carolina as a director of technology. And we had Apple II computers, Apple IIe computers in the school district. And I want to tell you a story about a librarian friend of mine, librarian at the school. Her name is Cynthia Wilson. I think she's retired now, but I'm not absolutely sure. But Cynthia Wilson was one of these librarians who took to technology. I mean, she instinctively understood how computers and ultimately the internet and modems and things like that plugged into how a library operates, how you can use this technology to enhance your library. Now, Cynthia had a group of 7th grade students that came into our library, and these were kids who today we would call at-risk kids. We didn't have that term back then, but these were kids who you couldn't get to write their name on the paper in the classroom. They were reluctant learners, reluctant students, for a variety of reasons. Well, she had these students in her library, and they were talking about writing, and she asked, "Do you think you could write a children's book?" And they all said, we looked at each other and said, "Sure, I mean, that'd be easy. We could write a children's book, no problem." So she took them over to, she had 7 7 Apple IIe computers, and she took them over to these computers, and she taught them how to use the word processor. And we were using something back then called Fred Writer, which was a free word processing program that had been developed by Al Rogers in California. And it was freely available. People made copies of it and shared them with each other. So she had a bunch of copies of this. She booted it up. She showed them how to use the word processor, and they set about to writing their children's stories, their children's books. When they finished, they took about a week working on this, coming into the library every day. And when they were finished, she told them, well, and she may have told them this up front, she said, "You know, I like what you're doing. I think what I'm going to do when you finish is I'm going to email." And we were using something called Fred Mail back then, which was also developed by Al Rogers out of California. And she said, "I'm going to email your stories to the elementary school down the street, so that some first graders there," I've got a first grade teacher friend there, and the first graders there are going to be able to read your stories. So the 7th graders got excited that there was going to be an audience. They were going to have a readership for their writing. So they finished the stories. She emailed each of the stories to her first grade teacher friend, and the teacher then printed out the stories and stapled them together and then handed them out to first graders. Now the first graders then read the books, but they read the books with crayons in their hands. They illustrated the books as they were reading them. This went on for a couple of weeks, and then they made arrangements for the first graders to walk up the street to the middle school with their books printed out, illustrated books. They walked into the library in the middle school where the 7th graders were all sitting behind tables ready to do a book signing. And these first graders were so excited to meet the authors of their books. And the thing is, the 7th graders were even more excited to be meeting people who were so excited to meet them because of what they had achieved. And this is a whole other kind of connection. It is a connection by constructing experience, but it's also a connection. I may be getting ahead here again, but it's also a connection through accomplishment. It is a connection through learners who are empowered not just to learn and answer questions, and not just to achieve a score, but they are empowered to accomplish something with what they were learning. And when we can accomplish something and we can share that something, then we can make connections not only with the teacher, but we can make connections with each other. We can make connections with the world. It's another way that educators can be connected. Now we're going to move on. Now that was probably 1988. We're going to move on to 1990. Where I had recently joined the State Department of Education, North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. So I'd moved to Raleigh, and I was, doing a lot of the same things that I was doing as Director of Technology in Portsmouth County, just at more of a state level. And one of my colleagues had been given a login for the internet. Now, I had been emailing in and out of the internet for a while through FredMail, but I'd never actually connected to the internet. I'd never actually done the internet. And we had this login to a university now that I could connect to the internet. She didn't have any real interest in it, so she gave me the login. And I learned how to do this. I learned how to use things like Telnet, and in fact, that was probably the only thing you used back then was this program called Telnet that you would use to log in to a computer, and you could surf around on the internet. Now, of course, it wasn't surfing around on the internet like it is today. You weren't pointing and clicking your way around. You were typing in these secret incantations. It was like the old DOS operating system. You typing in these incantations that would take you to different places, and you could download files and read stuff. And one day I got an email message as part of a mailing list. It was a public email message. Lots of people got copies of it. That was talking about a new service on the internet called IRC. Now, IRC stands for Internet Relay Chat. And essentially, it is a service through which you can go in and you can communicate with other people who are connected to that service at the same time. So you can communicate in real time with other people, not just read files and download files, but you can actually communicate people in real time, not email. So I went home that night and I started up the Telnet, and the email had announced that this service was available at North Carolina State University, which was there in Raleigh, right down the road from where I lived. So I connected to this service. I logged in, and it gave me a list of letters, A, B, C, D, and each of those letters represented, today we might call it a channel. Back then it was called a chat room. And so you could enter a chat room, and there would be people chatting in there. I chose D because D already had 4 people in it, and I didn't want to. I wanted to lurk. I wasn't ready to start chatting. I wanted to kind of experience it, see how this worked before I started participating. So I chose D because it had 4 people. They were already talking, and I went into this room. And I start seeing these messages scrolling down the screen, these 4 people talking to each other, and I very quickly realized that they were computer science students, and from their conversation, and they were talking about an exam that they had just taken, and they were not being at all polite about their conversation of this exam. And they continued talking. It was a computer science exam. They continued talking, and I finally got comfortable enough, confident enough that I broke in and I introduced myself. I told them who I was, what I did, for a living, and they very politely faked an interest in what I did for a living. But I asked them, "What do you think a 5th grader could do with this level of access to the internet?" Well, there was a long cyber pause. Because in 1990, nobody was thinking about 5th graders on the internet. It was still the domain of universities and research centers and the military. Nobody was thinking about school children on the internet. But finally, somebody said, "Well, you can go over to this place over here and you can download this information." And then somebody said, you could go over to this site, this server, and you could finger a downloading of the latest earthquakes that have happened around the world, longitudinal, latitudinal positions. And then somebody said, "We could go over here and you can download a list of the upcoming shuttle flights and the manifests on the shuttle flights." And they started getting really excited. You can tell when computer nerds are getting excited because the spelling improves. and they kept getting more and more excited until somebody finally said, "Well, this is really neat. There's all kinds of possibilities. Let's get together and talk about this, in real life, RL, in real life." And I said, "Great. Where are you going?" And they gave me the name of the pizza joint, which I didn't recognize because I only recently moved to Raleigh. So I asked them for the address, thinking it was one of those places across Hillsborough Street from the campus. And they gave me the address, didn't recognize that either. And I said, "Well, where are you guys anyway?" And somebody typed in Reykjavik, Iceland. And I typed, "I got to take a rain check," which is the name of this story. I've got to take a rain check because I'm in Raleigh, USA, and I can't make it. And I had no idea that y'all weren't here in Raleigh. And we continued to talk a little bit more, and then they started logging off, and I logged off. I thanked them all for the conversation, telling them how much I enjoyed it. And then I logged off, and I walked away patting myself on the shoulder. This was amazing. I mean, I had been talking to people from another country for free. And I went back to work, and I was telling people, how I was talking to all these people for free, how neat this was, how this is the future. And it took about 2 weeks for me to realize that the power of that experience was not that I was talking to these people for free. The power of it, the message behind this, was that I spent about 40 minutes talking to these people before I realized that they weren't at stake, before I realized that I was talking to people in Iceland. For 40 minutes, it didn't matter that we were a quarter of a planet apart from each other. It didn't matter that we had different native languages, that we came from different cultures. That we were connecting. We were connecting through ideas. We were connecting through proximity, but it was not a proximity to each other on the planet, but it was a proximity to technology. It was a proximity to the computer and the internet and the skills to use that computer and the internet in order to connect with each other. So I would suggest that the connected educator must be able to connect through space, regardless of geography, even regardless of time, but also be able to connect through ideas. And I'm probably going to hammer more on that one in just a few minutes. So we're going to move on just a little bit further. This would be about 1992 or so. This is before the World Wide Web. And the name of this story is Going Down the Rabbit Hole. Now, at this time, this was, Apple IIe computers. There were video games. There had been video games for a number of years, but the earliest video games didn't look anything like the video games we have today. They were called adventure games, and since computers, it was very difficult for computers to do really any kind of graphics at that time. It was all text based. So you would start this, you'd put your disk in, you'd start this game, and you would read a description of where you are. It would say you are in a wood-paneled room, there's a desk in front of you, there's a door to the left, there's a door to the right, there are 3 drawers in the desk. And then you could type in little 2- and 3-word commands to interact with that text-based environment. So you could go left, which would take you into another room, and you'd read a description of that room, or you could go right, or you could look desk and see what's on the desk, or you could open drawer, and it would tell you what's in the drawer, and then you could interact with those objects. Now, I had never really done any of this. It didn't really interest me, and video games still don't interest me that much. But then I discovered something called MUDs. Now, MUD stands for Multi-User Domain, or sometimes called Multi-User Dungeons and Dragons. Essentially, it was the same thing. It was a text-based game, but it was on the internet. It was a server out there on the internet, and you could be playing this game, but other people could be playing the same game with you. So part of the description of this environment would be, and in the corner is standing Pi-O-Pa, standing tall, and then the description of Pi-O-Pa. And I may be Pi-O-Pa, and I have described myself so that when other people encounter me, they read the description that I've written about myself. And I could be, anything. I could be any height, I could be any color, I could be, from any century for that matter. And so it started out as games, and it continued as games, but a lot of people, educators in particular, started seeing some potential in treating this less as a game and more as a sandbox, where it becomes a place where the activity is not in playing a game, but it's in building the environment and building the environment bigger and richer. I participated in a project out of MIT, the Media Lab, called Media Moo, I think. And there were a number of these things. There was MUD, multi-user domain. There was Muse, multi-user simulated environment. Mush was one of my favorites, multi-user simulated hallucination. Moo was probably the most powerful. And if any of you are familiar with Tapped In, a staff development service that operates in this way with a text-based environment, they operate, I believe, using a Moo, multi-user object-oriented is what it stands for. So I had fun with this. The local newspaper, Raleigh News and Observer, actually had a MUD server, and I got to know the guy who was running it, and and got a personality. I became a person there, and I built a couple of things. I built a museum called the Museum of Imagination, and it was the museum itself, and then there were display rooms, exhibit rooms, and each exhibit room had a different theme, and there was one for the history of newspapers. But what I encouraged, there were a few kids who were coming in, and what I encouraged them to do was to walk into a room where there was a bin, and of course this is still all text-based. You're reading about this bin with generic exhibits in it. Well, the student could then, the kid could then, or anybody could pick up a generic exhibit and then re-describe that generic exhibit as whatever they wanted to contribute to the museum. So if they're in the Hall of Agriculture, then they could contribute an old-time plow. But they had to be able to name it, and they had to be able to describe it. And the richness of that description depended on the richness of the object depended on the richness of the description. And the richness of the description came from the research that the student, the kid, had to do on this object, and also their ability to write it very descriptively. So this is a lot of fun, and this is one of the most exciting things that I've seen to this day on the internet is that it's a constructivist approach to teaching and learning, but it's also a language approach. You're doing it all with language. You're doing it all with text. You're doing it all with sentences and communication. There was a particular project that I developed a lot of interest in and some relationships with called Mirrormuse. And Mirrormuse was a group of educators at Maricopa College down in Phoenix, Arizona, I believe. And the leader was a woman by the name of Billy Hughes. And Billy had set one of these up. She and her staff had set up one of these environments, and they had set up a world, and they were doing a lot of experimenting with it. But they got to thinking, what would be the possibilities of school children coming in and having one of these to play in, to build in, to learn in. So they made arrangements with one of the principals of one of the middle schools. And during the summer, and I don't know, this is 92 or 93, during the summer, they had something called Mirrormuse Camp. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was Mary for Maricopa and Muse. And they had kids come in who were at risk. These were kids who had, I don't think they had necessarily failed, but they were, very poor students. And some of them a couple of them had actually been expelled during the year. And they invited them to come in. And their world, their virtual world was essentially flat asphalt when they first came in. And they were taught how to use it, and there were, they said things like, on the first day, the teachers heard whispering from the students saying, "This is so dumb. This is so dumb. I don't understand." But by the end of the first day, the teacher said that the kids all agreed that this was the coolest thing that they had ever seen, because they were building with ideas, they were building with text. There was one particular girl, her online name was Genji, or Genji. And Genji actually went home and bribed her older sister to take her to the library so she could research caves, because she'd always wanted to live in a cave. And she wanted to build by describing a cave in this virtual environment, and she wanted to be right. She wanted to be good. She wanted to be the rich sort of place that her friends would want to come and visit her in. So they built their homes. They visited each other's homes, and they started building a town. So they had lots of conversations about municipal concerns. They had to set up some rules, some laws on how they would have to behave. And there was one particular boy, I can't remember his name. There was one particular boy who had been expelled during the year, and he was a tough kid. He was a rough kid, and all the other kids were afraid of him. They didn't talk to him. They wouldn't talk to him. He didn't talk to them. He kind of stayed off to himself. But he secretly fell in love with this experience, with this activity, and he became very skilled at it, and he became the person who, in this world, the other kids would come to ask questions, say, "How did you do this? How do you do that?" And for a period of time, they didn't know that the person that they were talking to was this kid that they wouldn't have anything to do with in the real world. But he became very important to them. And I'm sorry, but I just blinked out again. I apologize. Okay. All right. I'll try to keep that from happening again. But you know, the power was that this boy was able to experiment with alternative ways of interacting with other people in a way that he probably couldn't in real life. But through this text environment, he was able to experiment with different ways and discover himself that he had value, that he had things to share, that he had the skills to share with these people. And as they started realizing who this really was, then that friendship, that sharing, those conversations started existing outside of the virtual world. I remember I attended their graduation at the end of the summer camp, and of course, as Pi Opa was my name, and I attended, and you know, a lot of the parents were there as well. Of course, the parents weren't in the virtual world; they were in the actual real world. But they were talking about how you know, many of them, the only reason that they'd ever come to school before was because their child was in trouble. You know, they'd never been invited to school in order to see things that their children had accomplished, things that were impressive. They'd never seen that happen before. And one of the teachers, one of the moments that she remembered the most was when, you know, at the end of the first couple of days, when the students looked up at her and said, "You don't think I'm stupid, do you?" You know, she was having a learning activity that she was successful in, and she suddenly realized that her teacher, who was there, wasn't considering her stupid, like was, you know, which was her experience. And when it was all over, the kids, when school started the next year, the kids helped these teachers write a grant to bring in 9 computers into the school and 9 phone lines. This is back when you had to have phone lines in order to connect to the internet. So they brought in 9 phone lines, got the funding to do that through the grant that the kids helped them to write. Now, I had an office at MIT at the time, a virtual office that was part of Micromuse, I think it was called, but I'm not absolutely sure. And I invited the teachers and the volunteers over for an interview. And I have that interview. I published it on the internet. And I'm just going to paste in, if I can find it, I'm going to paste in a hyperlink so that y'all can read that at your leisure. It's actually very moving reading some of the comments that the teachers had. So I'm going to paste in a URL for that, so y'all can go visit that at your convenience. So, you know, this was a connection. This is where educators, the connected educator, connects learners to each other through their accomplishments. You know, the learners are learning by connecting not just with the teacher and with the textbook and the chalkboard, but they are connecting with each other, and they're connecting through accomplishment. They're connecting through their success. They're connecting through trying to achieve the success with help from each other, which is a powerful form of learning. The next story I called "Wishing on a Fading Star." After I left the Department of Education, Department of Public Instruction, I connected with a friend who was connected to a group up in New York called Advanced Network Services. Now, Advanced Network Services was run by a man by the name of Alan Weiss. Alan Weiss had a great story. He was not a successful student. He dropped out of high school. He dropped out as a failure, dropped out feeling like a failure. But he got into the world of computers. And he discovered his own value, discovered his own strengths through this world of computer, and he eventually became a vice president at IBM. But he then left IBM, founded Advanced Network Services, and they created one of the important parts of the infrastructure of the internet back then. I don't know the details, but you know what they built, they eventually sold to America Online for lots of millions of dollars. And this was the beginning of the World Wide Web. This is 95, 96, 97. The World Wide Web was just beginning to be discovered in education. In fact, one of the things that I did for them was to go around and do workshops with teachers all over the East Coast. And I had the privilege and the thrill of introducing lots of teachers to the World Wide Web who had never seen the World Wide Web and the Internet before. And that was just that was a real high point for me personally, was having that thrill. But Al Weiss, you know, the World Wide Web is new. It's just now starting to eke into schools, and there was almost no educational content on the World Wide Web. And Al Weiss had the feeling, the opinion, that perhaps the best people to create educational content were people who are being educated, the kids who are growing up playing video games, who are familiar with this, that maybe perhaps they are the most qualified to start creating educational content. So they started a project called ThinkQuest. And at ThinkQuest, the students worked in teams, and they created websites that were designed to help other students learn something. There were different themes, there were different categories that they could work in. But one of the things that I thought was most powerful and informed me in a lot of my thinking was the evaluation. This is a competition. Advanced Network Services gave away over $1 million in scholarships every year to the teams who created the best websites. And the criteria for the judgment was not just the educational value of the website that the students created, but it was also the degree of collaboration, the challenge of collaboration. For instance, if the students are in different cities, you know, then they get extra points for that level of collaboration. If they are in different countries, they get more points. If they speak different languages, they get more points. One of the teams had a player in Russia who spoke no English, a player in a team member in Maryland who spoke no Russian, but there was a team member in Alaska who spoke both languages. And so they were challenged to break through some of these barriers, and they saw this as being a powerful thing, because when you're challenged to be resourceful, then you could perhaps come up with better ideas. So you know, being one of the consultants and one of the trainers for the project, I got to go to the award events, which were big galas that they had in Washington or Los Angeles and other places. Another criteria for the competition that I thought was very powerful was that the more people who visited your site, the more points you got. So the sites actually went live as part of the evaluation, as part of the competition. And so you're challenged by your collaboration boundaries. You're also creating valuable content, but you're also creating content that is going to draw the attention of other learners, of other students. So it's got to be something that's going to be, you know, not just fun, but something that's going to be engaging, that's going to draw their attention. So you had these different and other criteria. I remember one particular team as I was at the awards gala during one afternoon during the gala weekend. The students the teams each got a high-speed computer, you know, state-of-the-art computer, high-speed access to the internet. Perhaps a T1 line. I don't know what it was back in 1996. But one of the teams, toward the end of the afternoon, I was walking around and I was having conversations with different teams. Toward the end of the afternoon, I looked back in the corner, and there was a single boy sitting back there at their station. The other two boys had already left. They had left him there to answer any questions that came in. So I walked over, and you know, they had a big sign above their display, Middle Ages. So I walked over there. You know, I taught history, so you know, I'm not going to talk Middle Ages. I'm going to talk history of this kid. I'm going to impress this kid. And walked over, we started talking about the Middle Ages, and he proceeded to, you know, knock my socks off, you know, because it wasn't just the historic events, but what they had concentrated on was the nuances of the lifestyle. How did they have fun? How did they, you know, how did their families run? How did they, you know, how did they relax? How did they work? And it's just the nuances of the lifestyle of people who lived during the Middle Ages in Europe. And you know, I finally interrupted the boy, and I said, you know, where did you learn all of this? And he said, from college professors. And I asked, how old are you? He said, 14. Well, how did you learn this from college professors? Well, he said, when I had a question, something I needed to learn, I'd get on the internet and I would find a college course, that probably taught this thing. And there was always the email address of the professor of the course. So he would email a question to the professor, so that he could learn what he needed to know. Now, he then said, I never told him I was 14 years old. He said, I always told him I was a graduate student. And that type of resourcefulness, that type of innovation, of thinking through, of really understanding the nature of this environment and how we communicate and how people operate in it. I mean, what he was tapping into is what Alan November calls the grammar of the internet, the grammar of how the internet operates. And he understood this, and he was able to utilize this understanding in order to help himself learn things that would have been difficult to learn otherwise. Well, I've talked a little bit more with him, and I finally walked away crestfallen. And one of his teachers called up with me, tapped me on the shoulder, and she said, Mr. Warlick, you need to understand that the boy you were just talking to is not a successful student. He has been at risk of failing. She said, he has blossomed as a result of ThinkQuest, of this activity, because we and he has discovered that he has skills, that he has knowledge. And perhaps the biggest surprise is the leadership that he exhibited that nobody had ever seen before. And the experience of participating in this ThinkQuest team, the power of it was that he had access to content. But perhaps even more important than that is what I was saying before, that he had an understanding of how this worked and was able to utilize this. He was empowered. And as a result of that, he became confident in his knowledge. The next year, I remember I was having dinner with one of the teams, and they had an astronomy site that they had created. And they got to talking about how there was this comet that had just gone through, and they got to talking about how this was probably the last time we'd be able to see this comet, because it was very difficult to see it because of light pollution, because there's so much of the world is casting off light in the nighttime now that light bounces around in the atmosphere, and we just can't see the skies the way that we used to could. And I think many of you will agree with this. So this may be the last time that we see it. And one of the boys said, but if you think about it, as the world is becoming increasingly connected, as we are becoming, have new ways of communicating with each other, communicating with lots of people, it could be that by the next time this comet comes through, we could agree, as a hemisphere, that on this certain day, at a certain time, we're all going to switch our lights off so we can all go outside and we can all enjoy this comet. Now, it just blew me away. It just blew me away that he had come up with this idea, this suggestion, just out of the blue. He had come up with this, but again, it points to not the content that he had learned, but how well he understood this environment, how well he understood as a result of communicating with his friends and communicating with other people who provided them with answers to questions, that as this grows, if it grows, then some of these things that we lament, we may actually be able to solve, and we may be able to solve very, very easily. Connected educator learns through learners' creations. Connected educator helps students learn by connecting them through their creations. This is not a story nearly as much, and I'm going to have to skip one of my stories here, I know, but this is not a story nearly so much as it's just a realization that I made. When I taught myself to program in basic programming, I had to get a book. I had a book. I had to read this book. When I started teaching myself HTML, I didn't need a book. because there were these files that people had written out there on the internet, tutorials on making HTML. So people were publishing on the internet, whereas it was probably months before any books appeared in the library or in the bookstore about how to do HTML. Whereas almost immediately there were documents out there that you could download, that you could read, that would help you do this. But what I do today, and the way I learn today, I've been spending a lot of the last couple of weeks working on some on citation machines, some new features in citation machine, and I've been using a framework called jQuery, and I've known about it for a long time, but I've not been able to really make it work for me until this time. But of course, as is often the case, you do it the way the instructions tell you to, and it still doesn't work. What's wonderful about today's information environment is that it is likely that it hasn't worked for other people. And so other people have posed the question out there on the internet, this is what I've done, this is what hasn't worked, and can anybody help me? Well, down beneath that is an answer from somebody who has solved that problem, and they answer it. And what's powerful that's going on here, what just impresses me almost every single day, is that I am eavesdropping on conversations, that people are having conversations out there about what's working, what's not working. Those who don't know are connecting to people who do know, and they're having these conversations, and those conversations are being archived, and they become available to me so that I can type in a search phrase related to what I'm trying to do, and I find these conversations that have happened out there about this thing, and I'm learning from mistakes that people have made. I'm learning from solutions that people have come up with, and I think the most powerful thing, and there are other stories that I could use to demonstrate this, but the network that I learn through is not a network of wires, it's a network of ideas. I connect to people through ideas, not through wires, but I connect them because I have a question, and there's an idea behind that question, and I connect to other people who have answers, and there's an idea behind their answer. And the network is a network of ideas, and I think that's something that it's part of being literate today, but it's also part of being a connected educator today, is how to cultivate networks that are connected together by ideas, not just wires, but by ideas. At another story that I actually tell a lot, so I'm gonna skip it here about pyramids, and I'm gonna go on to my final story, part 10, a story of disconnect. This is a story that I've not told before, that I've wanted to, but I just haven't found the opportunity, and it fits in here. And this goes back again to when I was with the State Department of Education, State Department of Public Instruction. And one of our assistant superintendents, associate superintendent, had just attended a quality management workshop. I think that's what it's called, quality management. It's Denning. I can't remember his first name, but Denning was the person who came up with this. And he attended this workshop, and he was so impressed by it that he wanted all of his employees, all of the people in his department, curriculum and instruction, to attend it. So paid a bunch of money, hired these consultants to come in and teach it, and it was a room of about 150 people who were attending this workshop about quality management, and it was a good workshop. But what struck me, what stuck with me, what I remember was the day that the leader of the consulting firm, the leader of the workshop, asked us, and we're all instructional services folks, asked us, who do you work for? And the students. We work for the students. No. Who do you work for? We work for the families. No. Who do you work for? We work for the communities. No. We work for the future. No. Who do you work for? Well, we just couldn't get the right answer to that. And she finally said, the answer is you work for the legislature. And I immediately realized she was absolutely right. We had all taken these jobs because we were good educators and because we wanted to share. We had knowledge, we had experience, we had ideas, we had things to share. We wanted to enrich the classrooms in North Carolina, to enrich the learning experiences of the students in my state. But she said, you work for the legislature. Our job was not to work for those kids. Our job was to implement policy from the elected body in my state. And I realized on that day that my days were numbered at the Department of Public Instruction. That isn't what I wanted to spend my time doing, was implementing the policies of people who were not educators. If anything, were amateur educators. And the reason that I tell that story is to remind you that there are interests out there who don't want you to connect. There are interests out there for whom the empowerment that happens to you and your learners by being connected to the world that they're learning about, that power comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of the power that these interests out there have a vested interest in, that they now hold. It is government, it is social interests, it is political interests, and I think that this is one of the barriers to connection that needs to be part of our ongoing conversation. And it is a part of our ongoing conversation. Is how do we wrestle this connection and the power of that connection from those who have traditionally held that power. Some of them will adapt. Some of them will learn how to share that power and how to be a part of that and how to be a partner in that. Some of them are going to hold on and they're going to crumble. It's not a new story. This has happened in other industries, music and so on. But in education, it's a struggle that we're going to have to take. And this really needs to be part of our ongoing conversation, is how do we break through the limits that have been put in place and held in place by those who are seeking to hold on to that power. 20th century education is defined by its limits. 20th century education was defined by the limits of the classroom, the limits of the covers of the textbook, the limits of the bell schedule. 21st century education must be defined by its lack of limits. Thank you all very much for listening to my stories, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference.
David, thank you so much. I'm going to discourage Q&A at this point because we have 2 other sessions that are starting, but I'm clapping for you.
And I apologize, but it came out perfectly.
You were perfect.
I'm sorry.
It was perfect timing.
The timing came out perfectly.
Nice job. Thank you so much, David. Have a great day. Yes, brilliant.
Thank you. Bye-bye.